everyone, this is the final week of class, and this week we are going to be talking about responsive content and language assessment for English language learners. Let's go over our objectives for today's session. You will be able to discuss how culture and society shape cognition and perceptions of intelligence, which definitely affect English language learners and the way that their teachers see them. You'll also be able to define and describe culturally competent teaching and the strategies to promote culturally and sort of culturally valid assessment for English language learners. We're going to go over distinguishing content objectives from language objectives. And also, we're going to identify some problematic aspects of the language and content of math, science, and social studies for English language learners. I will also have you do some cloze activities and think about ways in which to create cloze activities that can test your English language learners' knowledge of grammar and of content. Okay, so we ask ourselves the question, to what degree does culture influence cognition? And I want you to keep in mind that culture and society definitely shape mental functioning and also the ways in which we express ourselves, organize information, solve problems, and even the ways in which we respond to questions. Okay, so I want to give you an example of this. Now, imagine that we are in school, okay, and this test question has been given to a student, an English language learner. The item says, bacteria and laboratory animals are sometimes used by scientists as model organisms when researching cures for human diseases such as cancer. Describe one possible advantage and one possible disadvantage of using bacteria as models to help find cures for human diseases. Okay, so think about the different experiences that we have, and the ways in which our experiences would shape how we think about this question and the answer we would give. Okay, so in response, the English language learner writes this. He says, the advantage is closer to being humans. And the disadvantage is there is no such thing as laboratory animals. All animals are our brothers and sisters and our spiritual teachers. We don't have the right to use or kill them unless it is for food. Okay, so we can see that the student has answered the question, but that their response is very much shaped by the way that they have been taught to think about animals, right? Or the way that their culture has been structured and to approach or perceive animals. Obviously, this is very different to what we are expecting in school, right? In school, we sort of learn as students, we learn what is expected of us, how we should be answering things, that we need to be taking an objective standpoint, okay? But the difference in the way that we answer is all about cultural influence, and just because the student, the English language learner student, answered in this way, doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. It just tells us that our cultural predispositions are very different, okay? And that the student may need a little bit more experience in school to understand the different ways that we're asking the student to respond in an educational environment. So language plays a critical role in how children categorize their world, also how they use language to interact with others, and to show what they know and to express themselves. Let me give you some other examples of what research has shown in the way that culture can affect ability. Okay, so Russian speakers have more words for light and dark blues. And because they have more words to sort of categorize the different colors, the different range of colors, they're actually better able to visualize discriminations between shades of blue than people from other cultures, right? Pretty interesting, right? So here you see in this example that language shapes perception. Because in their language they have many different words for the different shades of blue, they actually can discriminate those shades better. Here's another one. Some indigenous tribes say north, south, east, and west, rather than the more vague terms such as left and right, which is more vague than north, south, east, and west. And so when studies have been done on these indigenous tribes, they found that actually these people have greater spatial orientation than people from cultures who use left and right rather than north, south, east, and west. Okay, again, ways in which our language, our experience shapes our cognition, shapes the way that we perceive things. The Paraha, whose language replaces number words in favor of terms like few and many. So what that means is that instead of saying, oh, I have 3 apples, they won't say 3. They won't be that specific. They'll actually say, oh, I have a few apples, right? And so it's sort of left vague as to the specific number of apples that they have. So studies on these people have found that they're actually not able to keep track of exact quantities. And it's not because they are less intelligent or less able than other people who are able to keep track of those quantities, but it's because their language and their culture expectations predispose them to think about things differently, right? To think about quantities in a different way. Okay, different, not less. Right? And that's really important. That's the whole point here about language and culture affecting cognition. Okay, and last example. In one study, Spanish and Japanese speakers couldn't remember the agents, so the active people, of accidental events as adeptly as English speakers could. So the question was why? So what they found was that in Spanish and in Japanese, the agent of causality is dropped. So the subject, in other words, of the sentence is dropped. And it's made into a passive sentence, right? Where it's the vase broke itself, rather than saying, John broke the vase. And so here, because you're removing the agent or the subject who is the person who has broken the vase, right, they are less able to remember the agents causing accidental events. Okay, so again, hopefully you can see from those examples, and obviously the last one, that these are really to show you how language culture affects cognition. So we know that culture, obviously culture is everywhere, right? It's intangible, you can't see it, but it affects everything we do, and it definitely provides us an organization in which to work within, in a society, in a community, right? It gives us these implicit rules for behavior in a society, and in a school, right? In an educational system. And that's going to affect all aspects of assessment, including the methods, the choices, and the attitudes towards the assessment. And here's another example in the context of education, right, in school. So English teachers guide students by encouraging students to rethink their answers and providing positive comments and trying to avoid negative statements. We know that, especially if you've taken a classroom management course, we know that negative statements or blaming a student or shedding negative light on them is something that we want to stay away from in the American culture, right? In the American educational system, that is not seen as a effective way in which to manage children's behavior, students' behavior. Right? Instead, American teachers really try and focus on the positive or use positive reinforcement instead of negative reinforcement to manage that behavior. Okay. We also, in the American culture, try and evaluate students in relation to several factors. So it's not only how many items they get correct on a test, but we also think about their progress in general, how diligent they were, sort of how conscientious they were in trying to get to that place where they get all the answers correct, and also neatness. Neatness counts for something as well. Okay, so those are aspects of assessment that are culture-driven, the fact that we value diligence and neatness along with progress. If we were to compare that to teachers from other countries, for example, in France, French teachers refer explicitly to students' mistakes. So that is a cultural aspect of teaching and of the larger community culture itself, in that French teachers will not shy away from pointing out mistakes, because in their view, in their perspective, it is better to be direct about the mistake to avoid any miscommunications or misconceptions by the student of what they're doing wrong. Okay. Also very common in European and sometimes Asian cultures, students' final assessment is based on their performance alone. And many times tests are given orally, right? So in order to pass the test, you actually have to give an oral speech about all the information that you know in order to pass. And so if you get any of that information wrong in that oral speech, that's what's going to dictate your performance, right? They're not going to take into account how hard you studied or how well you are as an oral speaker. And so those are differences, again, in the culture and the ways in which culture can affect how you're assessed and how people see your performance. And those things have to be taken into account with English language learners because they come from different cultures if they've immigrated, or if they're younger students who have had less experience in the US educational system. Their ideas about assessment, their ideas about how people perceive their ability may be very, very different than what the reality is in the US school.